And so now we're going to talk about something you probably thought we'd be spending more time on throughout this course and also in this section of the textbook, and that is how a bill becomes a law, that we would be talking about procedures like that. Since Congress itself doesn't really pass much legislation now, why should we spend that much time on it? We'll talk more specifically about that in a few moments. In a later part in this lecture, we'll talk about why it is that we really don't see a lot of legislation that is passed, or when we do see legislation, why it happens at that time, and why there are long periods of time where it seems like Congress isn't really doing much other than yelling at each other and running for re-election and getting re-elected at really high rates. And so we're talking about how a bill becomes a law. And I think the best way is wrong, because that's how I learned about the political system. In between cartoons on Saturday mornings, they would have these short videos talking about, as we saw earlier, about some ideas of the Constitution and about the history leading into it. Learned a little bit about math. 3 is a magic number, I know. 0 is my hero. But there's also how a bill becomes a law with I'm Just a Bill. So I'm going to ask you to watch that on your own to get that little earworm into your head and then be humming it the rest of the time. So I suggest watching it multiple times just because I like it, but at least watch it once just to get a sense. And marvel at how, in a 3-minute song made for kids, they can actually do a pretty good job of explaining how a bill becomes a law. So, for example, it points out that most of the work is done in committees. They show that in the video. They show that in the committee is where they're doing a lot of the work, and that's absolutely true, and we're going to be talking about that in a few moments, and the textbook talks about that. The most of the work is done in the committees. It's done for efficiency reasons, because it's not efficient to have the entire House of Representatives, all 435 members, or all 100 members of the U.S. Senate, debating and thinking of the particulars of a bill. Instead, they send it to a committee that has a specialized interest and expertise, hopefully, in banking or agriculture or education. They write the legislation. They might even send it to a subcommittee. Then it gets sent to the committee. Then it gets sent up to the main floor of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So it actually gets quite a bit of that process right. They also point out that most of the bills die in committee. They show that as cartoons will do, but it is absolutely true that most of the bills that are introduced in Congress don't actually pass the House or the Senate, and certainly don't become a law, and they die mostly in committee. They think through these ideas, think about, write it up, and then in writing it up, they find out that it might not be a good idea. It might also be just that there aren't the votes that are necessary. It might be a great idea, but they don't have the votes that are necessary. It is a bicameral legislation, must go through the House and then through the Senate. It goes through the Senate and then through the House. And the song, it starts in the House and then moves to the Senate. But they're absolutely right. And that is a long, drawn-out process that has to be able to pass both houses before it's sent to the President of the United States. And then they also get right this idea of checks and balances, that if you have a majority of Congress, a majority of the House, and the majority of the Senate say yes, then the President can veto that legislation. And in my head, I always picture the bill with his little stamp saying veto whenever I say the word veto. That's just me. You don't have to do that. But they point that out and they get that right. And so in a span of 3 minutes, the video does a really great job of giving an overview of how a bill becomes a law. There are a few things that it gets wrong, and again, we take something that's super fun and analyze it to death, because that's what political scientists and academics generally are supposed to do. One is in the video, you see that the member of Congress is at his typewriter. So, of course, they don't use typewriters, but sits at his typewriter and writes up the bill. That doesn't happen. It's the staff that does that, or even, as we talked about with interest groups, it's actually the interest groups, because they have the expertise and because they know what sort of bill they want passed, they will offer to write the legislation. The lawyers of the Sierra Club, but the lawyers of the NRA can write up legislation and then hand it to the member of Congress, who then introduces it to Congress. So the member of Congress doesn't actually write up the bill. Furthermore, it's not going to just be one page. Generally, bills are thousands of pages long with a lot of details in them. But you get the point. They talk about the veto, as we had argued. That they do mention the veto, that even if a majority of the House and the Senate say yes, if the president says no, it's vetoed. And then they talk about that it is difficult to override a veto. They point out that if in fact you are vetoed, you get sent back to the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and they have a chance to override that veto. So they do point out that important aspect of separation of powers and checks and balances. But the reason that they give, that the bill gives in the song of why it's unlikely for a bill that's been vetoed to be able to be passed again and to override that veto, is one that's absolutely garbage. And it's one that is infuriating. That bill should know better. And that is that they argue, by then you're so old. And they argue as if the idea of school bus safety, which is what the bill in the song is about, is, oh, that was so 2017, we're not going to deal with that anymore. We're going to let school children get killed by trains because there aren't railroad. Of course, it's not because you're so old. The reason why it's so hard to override a veto is, as we political scientists, it is difficult to a majority to override a veto of the President of the United States. And that's impossible. Not impossible, but very, very unlikely for that to happen. Think about it. If, in fact, it is a Republican president who is vetoing the bill, and the Republicans have a majority in the House and the Senate, as they had before the 2018 election, that's something that is unlikely because they're of the same party. If they're of a different party, it's unlikely that they're going to have a two-thirds majority to override the veto. So usually, overriding a veto requires bipartisanship, and as we know, bipartisanship is something that just isn't done anymore. So overriding a veto is very difficult to do, and the song gets wrong why that is. In the song, they say congressmen. There are obviously women who are in Congress. When we talk about representation in the third lecture, there aren't enough. There's the highest number we've ever had in the House of Representatives, but it's not near the 50% that they should be to represent the gender breakdown in our society. It doesn't include the conference committee. That's super important institution. But then really does it need to? It's for kids. The song is for kids. Why do they need to talk about the conference committee? We do because you're studying it at the college level. And that is the point that if the House and the Senate pass different versions of a bill, which is pretty likely now, if you think about it, the House of Representatives is now controlled by Democrats. The majority of Democrats are in the House of Representatives, and the majority of the U.S. Senate are Republicans. And if they pass legislation on the same issue, it's probably not going to be very similar. And so what happens if the House and the Senate pass different versions of a bill? Well, it isn't that the president gets to choose which legislation he wants to sign and ignore the other one. Whatever is given to the president must be the same from the House and the Senate, and the same bill must be passed by the House and the Senate. So what is created is the conference committee, and it's made up of individuals from the House and from the Senate who then negotiate how are you going to compromise between the bill. And then that compromise version is sent back to the House and back to the Senate. And if a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate vote for that compromise one that's been negotiated through conference, then it's minor to veto. So that is important for us to understand because the piece of legislation must be the same. The piece of legislation the president signs must be the same that the House and the Senate has passed, but the song doesn't get into those details. And you can sort of tell why. Again, kids don't need to know that. But it is an important process that isn't explained there. But overall, I'm Just a Bill is a pretty cool song, I think it is, and it's a good way of understanding the process that comes along. It tells us quite a bit of some of the underlying dynamics that are important.